Everything that I need to be good and to be worthy of love has been poured out upon me in the blood of Christ. And on account of that, I can confess the truth, but I don't need anyone else to be a demon in order for me to be worthy of the songs of the angels. If you don't want Jews to know Jesus, then you're not a Christian.
Mm-hmm.
So if whatever pieces of information you think you have about the Jews, if your goal is not for them to know the name of Jesus Christ, then you don't believe in Jesus. And to whatever extent you call yourself a Christian, you're just clothing yourself in the based skin that you want to wear so that you can impress your friends or yourself. And I think what happens with zealous young guys is they perceive you're not allowed to say things that are true because this group over here says that that's offensive and hateful and racist. So you're not allowed to say the things that are true. And then there's a kind of a brain rot switch that's flipped where you then come to the conclusion, the more I'm not allowed to say it, the more true it must be. Part of the issue I see with this is I don't know what you would call this, the noticing fallacy. And it's this weird mental thing that people will do where they go, well, don't you think isn't it weird that so many people in the pornography industry are Jewish? And you go, okay, is it everyone? Or did you find a list of all of the people in the porn world and then you just filtered out all the Jewish names and then forgot all of the other names?
Mm-hmm. Before we begin our episode today, we just want to take a quick moment to say thank you. We've had success that far surpassed our goals in this past year. And because of this, we are working on a new endeavor with Adam Kuntz and others, something we are just very excited about here. We are starting a Lutheran Institute of Theology, which will give you formalized courses in theological subjects ranging from church history to theological topics to how to read the Bible with some of the best minds in the Lutheran Church. Individuals like Adam Kuntz, Christian Preuss, other professors at our Concordias, and our seminaries. We're just extraordinarily excited to share this with you. So please check down in our description where you'll see a link to our new website that provides more information on what we're doing there for the Institute and how you can help support us. Again, thank you for your support, and now enjoy the episode.
You were 12 when you moved to Indianapolis.
Mm-hmm.
So what was your formation like during that time? So what was adolescence like that led you to getting in?
Yeah, first year was not good.
Yeah.
So I was born in Minnesota. I was born in Duluth.
Okay, yes.
When I was 9 months old, my dad's a pastor. He's retired now, but it was his first congregation was in Munger, Minnesota, just outside of Duluth. And then that was only 9 months. It was not the easiest congregation in the entire world. So he took a call to be a mission planter in the Salt Lake area. And so I lived for 7 years in Sandy, Utah, just outside of Salt Lake, where my dad planted a congregation there. Then he took a call to Norwalk, Connecticut, where we were for 5 years. So Norwalk is southwestern Connecticut. It's kind of part of the greater New York metroplex. And then when I was 12, in 7th grade, he took a call to Indiana to start another mission congregation. So that was 7th grade was a rough year for me. I had incredibly good, close friends in Connecticut. It's hard to exist in general when you're 12, 13 years old. Infinitely harder when you move and you're completely starting over and trying to figure out your new place and wherever you go. And so that was kind of a rough year. Have you seen the movie Inside Out, the Disney Pixar movie?
We've read a book version with the kids. I haven't seen the movie.
So my kids were watching that one. So one day, a number of years ago, my kids were watching that, and it's all about this girl, and the characters are the emotions inside of her head, you know, and her family moves from Minnesota to San Francisco when she's about that same age, 12 years old or something like that. And there's a scene at the end where her emotions get all out of whack, and she runs away from home, and her dad finds her and brings her back home, and her mom looks at her and basically says, what's going on with you? And she looks at her mom and she says, don't be mad. She says, I miss my friends. Don't be mad. And I, as a grown man, this is not a movie for me.
Mm-hmm.
And I was sitting here watching that with my kids, and she says that, and I started like sobbing.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
And I realized, oh, I thought I had kind of emotionally moved on from that experience of having moved in 7th grade, but apparently that stuck with me on a kind of subatomic level.
Yeah.
And
what were your kids doing?
this is the best part. My son Gus, he's my second of my sons. I have 5 kids. He's the number 2. I don't remember how old he was at the time, maybe 10 or something like that. Mm-hmm. So he's sitting next to me, and so she says this, and I just start blubbering. And I'm not like, I don't cry normally.
Yeah.
I'll cry at the scene in To Kill a Mockingbird when after he defends Tom Robinson, and the preacher says to Scout, "Stand up, Jean Louise, your father's passing." Like, I'll get teared up there, and I get teared up a little bit at the end of Terminator 2 when he's doing the thumbs up as he's going into the water. But like, very few movies will make. So I'm not. It's not a typical thing for me. And so my son Gus is sitting next to me. So you're John, the oldest, and I'm Gus, right? And I'm right here. And Gus looks at me, and then he looks at his brother and goes, "It's like, what's going on with this guy?" And I was trying to explain. Well, you see, you'll go through this thing called puberty, and it will just rake fingernails over your cerebellum or your whatever part of your brain controls like emotional development. So it was 7th grade was a really rough year, and then after that I was perfectly fine and a wonderful, fantastic life. But that was a very, very difficult year, and apparently I just sort of buried those emotions for a long time. And then
Inside Out brought it out.
And then a while later my kids were watching it again, and I was like, all right, well, I know what's coming this time. That won't happen again. And it just happened again the second time I watched it. And then we showed it to my 6-year-old like a year ago. I was like, man, why? Clearly, now that I've done this twice, the same thing happens again. So there's just, if you live that experience of having left all of your friends behind and being totally torn upside down and like wanting girls to like you and they think you're gross, and just everything. It was just that was a tough time, but very much then came to love Indiana, and that's still what I consider home. So I was there moved there in 93, and then lived there until I graduated seminary in 2008. So I went to middle school, high school just outside of Indianapolis, went to Indiana University, an hour south in Bloomington, and then seminary in Fort Wayne, did my vicarage in Terre Haute. So
you did your vicarage at Terre Haute.
I did my vicarage in Terre Haute.
That's where I did my vicarage.
Is it right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Pastor Meyer was still there.
I had Pastor Sutton.
You had Pastor Sutton.
But Pastor Meyer was still there.
Yes.
Yeah.
So Pastor Sutton was 1 year before me. He was the vicar before me.
Okay. Yeah.
So Pastor Meyer, who was my vicarage supervisor, kind of the small world of the LCMS. So his first congregation was probably 35 minutes from here, in a town called Ellisville. And now it's Pathfinder Church. It's still LCMS, but
what's Pathfinder mean?
I don't know. Okay. They changed their name to that.
Wasn't there a movie called Pathfinder?
Yeah, and there's a Nissan SUV called Pathfinder.
Yeah. So it's named after one of those, most likely.
Well, all right. So there was a video I watched from the pastor. I don't know if he's still there. This is a number of years ago, 10 years ago or so. And so that's the congregation where my mom was confirmed. My point with this was Pastor Meyer was a pastor to 4 generations of my family. So he was my grandpa's pastor, my mom's pastor, my pastor, and my son's pastor.
Wait, Pastor Meyer was?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Because his first congregation was was where where my mom was for a little bit.
The pre-Pathfinder congregation.
Yeah. So it was called St. John's Lutheran Church, and then
That's kind of boring compared to
Pathfinder. They decided that they didn't want to have Lutheran in the name for whatever reason, so they started calling themselves St. John Church. And then they go, everyone thinks we're a Catholic church. There's a word you could insert into the name that will make it abundantly clear that you are not a Catholic church. And oddly, it is the same word that you took out of the name that was there before. And so they go, well, we've like surveyed our community and they don't know what this means. So we're going to give like a name that, that reflects a sort of earnest desire in the congregation for whatever, or even in the community for whatever. And so they go, we're going to call ourselves, people don't know what St. John's Church means. So we're going to call ourselves Pathfinder Church. All right. Well, I mean, like St. John's like in the Bible. Pathfinder's not. So also I think it's an unforced error to develop your entire kind of aesthetic, congregational aesthetic, around the desires of people who don't have the Holy Spirit and don't know what the church is and don't know what they should expect the church to be.
It's a good way to trick people, though, right? Like, 2 months in or so, or someone's like, wait a second, you guys are Lutheran?
Yeah.
Yeah, we got you.
Right. And I don't know, I've never listened to a sermon from them or anything of that nature, so I can't speak to that. But yeah, the impulse to say, well, we want to name ourselves something that means something to the community, right? And like we surveyed them. One of the sort of weird things about that is that I don't think this is a real hard thing to understand. Like if you look at statistics of people will say, church statisticians, whatever that word is, will say 20% of Americans are in church on a given Sunday. There's no way that number is accurate. If you'd run into traffic if 20% of the population were going somewhere on Sunday morning. So the reality is 20% of people say they're in church on Sunday morning, which means it's probably half of that, because people will say they go every week when they absolutely don't. Like when the people do these surveys, people will give the answer they think they're supposed to give, rather than the answer that's actually true. So people who say they go every Sunday will kind of go every other Sunday, and people who say they go once a month go 4 times a year, and people who say they go 4 times a year went to church 4 years ago. That, it's that kind of thing.
Well, we were at McDonald's one time. We'll go there to take the kids and let them play in the play place. We don't usually eat the food, but we were sitting there, and there was this lady sitting next to him. My wife started talking to her or something. She was probably in her 60s or whatever. I don't know how it came up. I was just sitting there, and she's like, "Oh yeah, I go to church at Trinity," which is the church like I'm a pastor at, right? I'm looking over, I'm like, I've been a pastor there for 3 years, and she doesn't have a clue that I'm the pastor there.
Right. Yeah. So it's people give the answer that they're supposed to give. Like when the dentist asks you how often you floss, which I'd never liked that question, because I'm sitting there going, you're the expert. You're looking. Saw the blood coming out of my gums. You know how often I floss my teeth. Like I'm not. So I'm not going to lie. But of course, people will lie in those scenarios.
See, that always messes me up with whenever they're like, so how many alcoholic drinks do you have a week?
Right.
I'm like you already assume I'm going to lie here.
Right.
So if I tell the truth,
you have to cut it.
You're going to think I've got way more than that.
It's like height inflation. I'm 5'9" maybe a tick under 5'9", being perfectly honest. But I have to say I'm 5'9", because guys who are 5'8" will say that they're 5'9", and guys who are 5'7" will say that they're 5'9". So I don't want to lie, but in order to keep up with, in order to make sure that everyone knows, I saw a thing that the other day that Anthony Fauci is supposedly 5'7" tall or 5'8" tall. Come on. That's a pro wrestling number right there.
Yeah.
That guy's 5'4", if I've ever seen it. So, but you got to just lie to keep up with everybody else.
I said I was 6'2" for probably a decade.
Yeah.
I'm not. I'm like 6'1.5".
Okay. Yeah.
And so if you want proof of sanctification, for the last about 6 months, I've been telling people I'm 6 foot.
Right. But the problem is that people have a false understanding of what 6 foot is, because everyone else is lying about it.
Yeah.
So how long do people lie about something before it just becomes true? But going back to my point with that, I just think that there's a danger in asking people who don't know what the church is, what their spiritual needs are, what they want the church to be. They don't have the slightest. Like if you go to a doctor and your doctor says to you, "Well, what medicine would you like?" It's kind of your job to tell me, what pills I should be taking. I know what makes me feel good, so I can go in, and I had kind of had back problems throughout the years, and for a while I had a doctor who gave me Valium as a muscle relaxer. All right, well, if it's up to me, that's the cure to all of my problems. I have an ear infection. Can I get some Valium for that ear infection? So yeah, there is, you need to be the one leading. You need to be the one actually telling them what they need, and trust that the Holy Spirit will, according to His will, create faith that recognizes that and rejoices to receive those gifts. So.
Yeah. So you were at Emmanuel.
Yeah, I did.
And you
so
under Meyer.
Yeah,
and then
under Pastor Meyer.
So when you were growing up, did you think? 'Cause I'm a pastor's kid as well. Like, were you thinking I'm going to be a pastor, or were you thinking?
It was always kind of in my mind there.
Okay.
I mean, I had dreams of other things that I wanted to do and ideas for other things that I wanted to do, and it's really kind of cool to have seen in my life how everything that I liked and every other thing that I kind of seriously thought that I might like to do all sort of came together in a lot of the stuff I've done. Not so much as sort of certainly not my word in sacrament ministry per se, but in the kind of pastor adjacent stuff that I've done. So when I was younger, when I was a kid, I wanted to be a movie director when I grew up, and I wanted to write my own movies, and then I kind of lost sight of that. I didn't really see a path in front of me when I was in school. I was not a good student. I was a mediocre student. I got A's in the classes I was good at and put no effort into the classes I wasn't, got C's in those classes, and then had a kind of perpetual B average in high school and college. So as I tell the kids in my congregation, just know that, like, if you don't really apply yourself, you'll end up like me and have a really amazing, fantastic, rewarding life.
Yeah.
So be careful. But no, so I loved movies, and I loved humor and sketches and stuff like that. And I loved music. And so coming out of college, I played in a band in college. And I thought for a while that I might maybe want to move to Nashville and try to become a songwriter.
What was your instrument?
None really. I mean, I noodle a little bit with piano and guitar, but I sing. And so that was what I did. I sang in the band and got into songwriting in college. And that didn't quite work out. And then I spent a year off in between college and so I majored in English in college. I always kind of, my dad's a pastor, a bunch of my uncles are pastors. I had a very realistic sense of what the office of the ministry was and what it looked like on a very practical level. So it was never something that I was running away from. But I went off, I go to college, I major in English. I didn't really have any clue what I wanted to do when I was done with college, but I struggled with depression a lot in college. And I was so burnt out of the school idea. I didn't quite understand that it was depression that I was going through. I thought it was hating school. That was why I was so despondent, as opposed to I wasn't exercising ever, and I was not eating real food, and any other number of self-destructive, habits. And so you look back now and you're like, well, that was obvious. The problem wasn't the school; it was all of the other stuff kind of surrounding that.
So when you would fix those things, did the depression go away?
No, I mean it's always something I struggle with. It's there's a kind of baseline that I've been off and on meds throughout my adult life, and the meds have been for me really helpful. But they kind of keep me at a baseline where if I don't do the other stuff, then there's only so much that the meds can kind of do. And that to me is a thing with depression is I'm very firmly convinced there's a very deep spiritual component to it. Because while I believe it's a disease in a sense, there aren't, like, if you have a kidney disease, your kidney disease doesn't give you an overwhelming urge to do things that are terrible to your kidneys. Or like if you have liver disease doesn't give you an uncontrollable urge to binge drink. Whereas depression gives you an uncontrollable urge to do the things that make it so much worse, whether that's sloth, whether that's substance abuse, pornography, like any number, kind of all of that stuff kind of thrown in there. And so I do think there's very much like the devil is able to kind of perceive that weakness in the kind of chemical composition of what's going on there and attack you that way. And that's something I think that people always need to be aware of, that while medicine can be helpful, you have to actually address the deeper underlying issues and do the natural things that God gave you to actually fill your life with meaning and peace. There's a bit I've sort of had for a while. I've done stand-up comedy a couple times, and there's a bit I was kind of developing in my mind talking to other comics. I've done stand-up a couple times. I just go to open mic nights, and I don't I've had people in my congregation say like, "Oh, tell us when you're going out," and I go, "No, I'm not. I won't."
Yeah,
because there will be other comics,
Mhm.
and I will not say swear words, and I will not talk about the most horrific things on earth, but they will.
yeah.
and I don't want you to sit through a whole night of that to watch me do 3 minutes of material.
Isn't there something isn't it, like depression is higher in comics? Like,
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and this is right. This is what I'm getting to
Okay.
is that these guys get up and they all talk about how they have mental illness, right?
Mhm.
And then they talk about how they watch porn all day and smoke pot all day and never exercise, and you're going, no, that's not mental illness. That's your brain is actually functioning properly. Like the reason you feel bad is not because you have a mental disease. The reason you feel bad is because your life is terrible.
Yeah.
And it should make you feel bad.
Mhm.
Like in the same way that if I threw fire in your face and it burned your skin, you wouldn't go, like, I have a sickness with my epidermis.
Yeah.
You'd go, no, that's actually healthy. If I threw fire at you and your skin didn't react to it, then you would go, oh, there's something wrong. I immediately need to go see a doctor.
Mhm.
So in the same way that, like, if you're doing stuff that just nukes your brain chemistry and fills your heart with sorrow, even if you can't properly understand it, that's your brain is actually responding the way it should to you being mean to your brain.
Mhm.
So to me, I mean, I don't know if this is the clinical definition or not, but for me, mental illness is better understood as you're actually doing the things that you should be doing.
Mhm.
And yet your brain is rebelling against that and filling you with all kinds of sorrow and despair. Like, so I've heard people talk this way about where they'll say things like, after my dad died, I just slipped into a really bad depression. And you're going, no, that's grief. That's how you're supposed to feel.
Mhm.
Like you would be very mentally ill if you just shrugged off your dad dying.
Mhm. Yeah.
You're like, all right, well, anyways, but back to the old grind, and and it didn't bother you anymore. That's mental illness.
Yeah.
But being completely consumed by grief over a thing that should fill you with grief is not. It doesn't mean there's not obviously behaviors and things that you should do to help yourself out in that
Mhm.
situation. But this idea of kind of treating your brain as though there's something going wrong with it when it reacts to the mean things that you're doing to it
Mhm.
is, we have to have I think you just have to have a better understanding of what mental health struggles actually are.
Mhm.
It seemed to me that kind of culturally we were sort of over the target for about 5 minutes, where it used to be like, hey, if you're struggling with depression, don't ever tell anyone that, and we'll just all assume that your faith is weak
Mhm.
and you're and you just don't believe in Jesus enough. And then we went, oh, yeah, that's not the problem. Let's not talk that way, and let's not indicate to people that that's the issue. But then all of a sudden it went to, if you have a mental illness, you're not accountable for anything,
Yeah.
which incentivizes people to view themselves that way.
Mhm.
And then also it treats sadness or grief or sorrow as an infection,
Mhm.
as opposed to, well, no, I mean, there's a theological sense in which we can say that, like, you weren't created to feel this way. But in terms of like living in the fallen world, no, you should actually feel bad when terrible things happen.
Mhm.
And you should feel bad and you should feel worthless when you're doing things that make you worthless, and when you're doing things that alienate you from God and that hurt the people that you love. Like, you're
Mhm.
not supposed to feel good about yourself.
Yeah.
So if you're not accomplishing anything, you're watching TV and smoking pot all day, like, you should feel like a loser,
Mhm.
because that's loser behavior, and that's not what you're created to do. And you shouldn't expect to find validation or peace in living that way.
Mhm.
And
It seems like there's an aspect too there, as you're talking, like some of it's going to be internal, like things that you're doing, but some of it's just going to be you're encountering external evil throughout your life.
Right.
So if you're rightly calibrated, like as you see things that are wrong or you hear
Right.
things that are wrong and whatnot, like that should have some kind of effect on you.
Right.
And if it doesn't, that's the deeper issue.
Right. Yeah, and obviously we need to be wise and winsome and in terms of how we help people deal with that.
Mm-hmm.
And we shouldn't treat it as though like we'll just walk it off,
Mm-hmm.
right? But the idea that there's something fundamentally wrong with you, or that you have a disease or kind of a faulty wiring when you're responding to foreign elements in ways that's actually the way that your brain should respond to them,
Mm-hmm.
is an enormous failure to really understand what we're dealing with in that regard.
Yeah. So what were some of the things that you noticed that had the biggest correlation on kind of leading to depression? Like, were there certain foods? Were there certain actions? Were there certain
Yeah. I
atmospheres?
mean, it wasn't. I mean, when I was really struggling with that stuff, my depression has largely been it gets aggravated by circumstantial, by stuff surrounding me.
Okay.
So when I first struggled with it was when we moved when I was a kid, and I was just buried under a depression when I was a kid because I moved away from all my friends, and then also you're the ugliest you'll ever be in your entire life. At the time in your life, you're like, I would really like to be attractive to girls.
Yeah.
And God goes, no.
That's such a good thing, isn't it? Though,
It
like
is.
the kids they knew, like in high school, that were really attractive, like
Yeah.
they got kind of beat up, like
Well,
they fell into those sins. And
My bigger thing is that making you teenage boys, preteen teenage boys being stupid and smelly is how God prevents mass teen pregnancy. Because right around the time that girls can get pregnant
Mm-hmm.
and they like really start wanting male validation,
Mm-hmm.
you can't just put them in a room 7 hours a day with guys who are suave and sophisticated and like know how to be endearing and know how to flirt. That would that would be a disaster for civilization. You have to make boys as stupid and smelly and ugly and just weird and annoying as possible.
Yeah.
So that you just give everyone kind of a chance to sort of get their footing,
Mm-hmm.
and then get to an age where you're able to actually get married and have children together.
And I think it's good to meet your spouse when you still have that awkwardness, because then you appreciate the affection and love that the other person gives.
Yeah.
Like I've noticed certain couples where you can just tell like they weren't used to getting a ton of validation, and then they find that in the other person, and like that bond of love becomes real strong.
Yeah.
And then you get people that are like, you're already a successful lawyer, you've got the nice
Right.
car, like you're past all these awkward stages, you know how to go on a date and like hold
Right.
yourself in such a way that's impressive. Like at that point, you've got this mentality of like, let's find that right person who's going to be lucky enough to find me. And if that's kind of the way you enter into the relationship, you're gonna be more egotistical and less appreciative of the affection.
See, this is why in some ways I'm glad I have depression.
Mm-hmm.
Because one of the worst things for a person's soul is buying into your own hype.
Mm-hmm.
And when you have depression, you never buy into your own hype.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if it's the depression or being very Norwegian as I am, but like when people give me compliments, it's the worst thing that happens to me that day. Just look at the floor and just, please stop saying nice things about me. I don't like the way that this makes me feel. When I was in college, I desperately wanted a girlfriend. I was super lonely. And I lived in a dorm at IU called Reed, which was IU has one of the best music schools in the country.
Mm-hmm.
And so Reed was right across the street from the music school. We had a ton of music students there, and they had these really, really amazing, fantastic grand pianos in all of the lounges. And I would sit and I was a wannabe songwriter, and I could noodle on the piano. I wasn't anywhere near approaching good, but enough to like trick a dumb girl into thinking I was good at the piano, And so I would sit down and I would start working on songs that I was writing.
Mm-hmm.
And in my mind, I'm sitting here going, here's how this is going to work out. I'm going to be playing this song, and some girl's going to come by, and she's going to stop at the piano. And I'm just going to like not even look up, and I'll just be playing and singing. And then I'll finish, and I'll look up, and she'll go, "What was that?" And I'll go, "Oh, it's just just a song I wrote." And she'll go, "You wrote that?" And then we'll fall in love and get married, right? So that was my plan. And it would 100% work, right? Every time I did it, I would be sitting there playing, right? And then some girl would come up and she'd stop and like put her hand up on the side of the grand piano. And then I'd finish and she'd go, "What was that?" And I go, "Oh, it's just, it's like this song I wrote." And she'd go, "You wrote that?" And then immediately I'd go, it's like 3 chords and the lyrics are all wrong. Like, why are you impressed with this? Never mind. Like, you have such low standards that you're impressed with this that I'm no longer interested in you. So that's how, like, that's a way in which the struggles of depression can help you out.
Yeah.
Is that you go, the fact that I wanted this to work, but as soon as it did, I go, the fact that you can't see through how transparently stupid and self-serving this is, I'm no longer interested in you whatsoever. So that saved me from a lot of, what would have been shallow and empty and worthless relationships. So in some ways, depression's kind of can help you out a little bit in that it can be a challenge in that you can't stop thinking about yourself.
Mm-hmm.
But it can be helpful in the sense that you never buy into your own hype.
Mm-hmm.
You never buy in. Whenever anyone praises you, you're like, yeah, but I'm glad you liked the one good thing I did this week. But can I introduce you to the 7,000 terrible things that I've done? Terrible things about me that I can't stop thinking about.
So that was taking place in college and kind of moving on. But so towards the end of college, you've got kind of that mindset. You're trying to figure out what to do. What leads from there to going and being a pastor?
Yeah. So
and how did that kind of affect even once you got into a pastor? Like, were you thinking like I can do this? Were you kind of thinking I can't do this?
So I had a year off in between college and seminary, and so when I had finished college, I was, again, like I was saying before, I couldn't handle the idea of more school, and I knew that it wasn't like I said, it wasn't like I ever ruled out the possibility of being a pastor. But I just thought, there's things I'd like to explore and try out. And I loved recording music. I still to this day, absolutely love recording music. This is one of the great things about the Lutheran Satire stuff I've done and other stuff that I've done is I've been able to really kind of pour into my passions in a way that I couldn't have if I'd gone into some other line of work. And so I started interning I had a year off between college and seminary, which was largely spent substitute teaching. I was just kind of looking for whatever jobs I could get at the time. And for a little bit, I started interning at a recording studio in Indianapolis where the guys in my band and we had recorded a demo there a year or two before.
Mm-hmm.
And because I loved recording music, and I thought maybe I can just do this for a bit and then I'll move to Nashville and I'll see if I can become a producer. And then I realized, I don't like working with other musicians. I like recording my songs, but the second I come across something that I think is juvenile or gross, and that was what a lot of the stuff was, I was like, I don't have any interest in this. And then the other thing was working with musicians. Like, these aren't normal human beings. They're weird, and they work weird schedules, and their brains don't function the way normal people's brains function, and so I don't want to deal with that.
What's more enjoyable to work with, musicians or comedians?
No, comedians definitely, because they're all filled with self-doubt, and those people are more fun to deal with than people who are utterly convinced of their own genius when they don't have any.
Yeah.
So I realized, I was like, I don't think the music thing is. I want to get married and have kids.
Mm-hmm.
And a world where, like, you're going into a recording studio at 1:00 in the morning and you got to wait for the lead singer is going to go smoke some pot and get high because he doesn't think he can really put in a good performance until he does. Like, I don't want to deal with any of that.
Yeah.
And then I was substitute teaching, and I thought, I really like teaching, but if I'm going to teach, like, I love Jesus and I want to talk to kids about Jesus. So that's probably what I should, if I'm going to teach anyone, that's probably what I would want to teach. And then I worked, there was an airline based out of Indianapolis at the time called ATA Airlines. I don't even remember what it stands for. American Trans Air or something like that. And they were kind of a competitor of Southwest. And I worked in their complaint department for maybe 6 months.
Yeah.
So before I started that job, I thought, maybe I'll go to seminary at some point, but like I need so much time off of school. I can't handle school. And then I worked normal jobs, and I thought, I'm ready to go back to school. I had a job just getting yelled at all day for things that weren't my fault, which was great training for the ministry. And because you'll spend a lot of time getting yelled at for things that, not a lot of time, but there will be moments where you definitely get yelled at for things that are 100% not your fault.
Yeah.
trying to talk unreasonable people off of ledges, and people who have unreasonable expectations. It was actually kind of good training for the ministry in that regard. But I thought, this is ridiculous. Can't do this. And so after a bit, I thought, I don't know. And I remember having a conversation with my dad where I said to him, I don't think I'm a good enough person to do this. And there's something that he said kind of in response where he basically said, look, we need good pastors. And I come from a really long line of pastors.
Mm-hmm.
My dad's a pastor. My mom's dad was a pastor and seminary professor. And then my dad's grandpa was a pastor. And then it's like pastor all the way back. And they're on kind of all sides of the family, basically all the way back to the days of the Reformation. And my dad said, like, look, we've been in this fight for generations, and we need guys who can do this. And I remember kind of thinking that, like, I'm very skeptical of guys who have a really good story for why they went to the seminary.
Mm-hmm.
So when I was filling out paperwork when I first got to the Fort Wayne Seminary, you had all this paperwork you had to fill out for like seminary, for grad school accreditation purposes and seminary accreditation purposes. So there was this question on there, and it was your answers were 1 to 5, and 1 was like not at all, and 5 was totally yes. And there was all these questions about this, like, why did you come to seminary? And so one of them was, you're picking these things, of reasons that you came to seminary, like you grew up in a church family, whatever the reasons might have been.
Mm-hmm.
Someone suggested that you might be a good pastor or whatever it might be. And then one of them was direct revelation from God.
Was it really?
Yeah. And I picked 3, which was somewhat, because I thought that was the most dismissive answer I could give to. I just like the idea of, like, someone goes, so wait, what happened to you again? You go, all right, so I was in this boat in the middle of the lake, perfectly clear day, and then all of a sudden a raging tempest comes upon the waters and crashes the boat about to and fro, and the boat capsizes, and I feel myself sinking into the icy deep, and then a hand composed of pure light and warmth pulls me out of the depths and says, Hans Fiene, I command you to go to Concordia Theological Seminary. And someone goes, oh, so that's why you want to be a pastor? And I go, well, a little bit. That's part of the reason. That was the most dismissive answer to me. But I'm kind of skeptical of guys who have really good answers.
Yeah.
Because and I worry that they won't make great pastors, because if you think you're just a cowboy riding out with the cavalry to save the day, cavalry. I always say that word right.
Yeah.
Hazard of being a pastor.
Mm-hmm.
Riding out with a cavalry, you'll burn out quickly. But I grew up in a pastor's family, and I remember kind of thinking, the way I sort of view this going into the ministry is, it's like if you're walking down the road and you see a building that's on fire and you hear someone calling for help, and the firemen aren't there yet, and you go, all right, well, I got a strong back and I can hold my breath for a while, so I should probably run in there and do this.
Mm-hmm.
Where it's not a matter of, like, God needs me, and or I felt this burning calling in my bosom. But it's just, I know what the vocation is, and it needs to be done.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I can do it. And so it wasn't a matter of, so it's, I think if you go to the ministry, if you're basically kind of like your emotional core is going fine,
mm-hmm.
then you'll probably do well as a pastor. And if your emotional core is, let's get to this and, let's really get down to business, it's probably not going to go all that well.
Yeah, for me, it's kind of similar to you. The toughest questions always, and everyone asks it, like, so what made you want to be a pastor? And it's just like, I don't know. Like, I didn't really want to. And then, I was working in Indianapolis, logistics broker, worked at Lifetime. Yeah. And, eventually I was just like, I don't know, these are all that fulfilling, and Right. It's like, well, my dad was a pastor, and which is why I didn't want to be a pastor.
Right.
Even though he was a great, great father and great pastor and had a good church. And then eventually I was like, well, what he did was rewarding. And I was like, all right, like, I guess I'll go. But I've run into like high school kids, and I probably shouldn't disparage it, but, like, I remember some of my, individuals that I'd run into that were like in high school, sophomores, juniors, and they were like, I want to be a pastor, and I'm in Seminary at the time. They'd come up and they'd be like, they want to talk theology, which is cool, right? But there was this like, it kind of breeds like this, almost as if you're in the role already, you know? And it's, I don't know, to your point, like there is, a reluctance is good.
Right.
Of like, you know, but rather than it being your identity, because if that becomes your identity,
right,
then that's where it can become egotistic.
Yeah, and I think a major problem that we have, not just the LCMS, everyone has this problem. The problem is the ministry is incredibly attractive to people who want a captive audience, but don't have the talent to earn it.
They're speakers looking for hearers.
Right. And so I remember back during COVID and everyone was putting up videos of whatever dumb stuff they were doing in worship. And I'm on Twitter or whatever it was. And there's this video of some UCC church or some church that's maybe associated with Union Seminary, whatever it was. And they got a lady pastor. And for their call to worship that they're doing, she's taken a song from the musical Pippin, which I only know because my sister was super into musical theater. I do not want, whichever of these cameras I'm looking at, don't think that I voluntarily know the songs from the musical Pippin. It was against my will that I know them. But she starts singing a song from the musical Pippin and like slightly changing the words to be called to worship. And you look at it and you go, that's just a failed theater kid who just wanted a captive audience and wasn't good enough to make Broadway.
This was the easy route.
Yeah, and so this was like, here's a way that you can just get and they'll be nice too. Like there'll be old folks who will tell you how great it is when it's not great, and you won't have to earn it. You can just get it. They'll just hand it to you. And I do think that's a huge problem in every denomination, like whether you're Orthodox or heterodox or straight heretical, like whatever it might be. There's just a kind of an instinct in people that goes, I can get a group of people who will validate me if I follow this path. And I think guys need to be really cautious about that, which is, I think, why a lot of times guys, it's a good thing if your dad was a pastor, because I saw the warts of that life and knew full well, like, I'm not going to go into a situation where people are necessarily going to just adore me. And I don't, and again, the depression thing is kind of helpful there, because like, I feel very uncomfortable with that. But I just felt like, I knew what the gospel was, and I knew how to articulate it in a way that I thought would be beneficial to people, even if they themselves weren't really aware of how well, of how you're doing that.
Yeah. I noticed that at Sim a little bit, to where like there's a prestige with the office itself, right? And we don't want to diminish that, but there was, I watched, and some of articulated sense, I remember one individual, for instance, like he came in, great guy, and for like maybe a year or two, he started to have like this vision of grandeur, and not in like a selfish way. Like he wasn't a prideful individual, but he felt like he had to become something to fit this office. And he came out of it, which was really nice. And he's articulated that he learned from that. But I remember watching that and thinking, as a pastor's son, like I understood the importance of the office, but like it's so approachable in that, like, this is my father's role. It's not so like foreign and grandiose and unknown, to where it kind of protects you from falling into that, I think, not across the board, but it's very helpful to be like, well, my dad was, and his coworker was, and I knew them, and like, the regular guys, and
right, yeah. So my dad's a normal human being,
right,
and he talks normally from the pulpit, right, and I think in a lot of ways, I think that the kind of stereotypical Fort Wayne grad and the stereotypical St. Louis grad are actually kind of the same person, in the
kind of on the outskirts. Like the outskirt of Fort Wayne on one side, the outskirts of St. Louis on the other.
So, all right. So stereotypical Fort Wayne grad, regardless of whether or not it's actually accurate at all, is the idea of like, a guy gets to a parish and he immediately moves the baptismal font to the proper location of the baptismal font, and immediately starts, genuflecting. And when people complain about them, he just hectors them about the fact that they don't sufficiently value the sacrament or whatever it is, right? And then the typical St. Louis grad, again, this may not actually be anywhere near reflective of reality, but sort of the stereotype is guy who gets to a congregation that's just kind of had normal things, and he starts wandering from the pulpit every week, and he starts overhauling the liturgy and doing all these things different. And when people complain about it, he just hectors them about how they're not interested in outreach.
Yeah.
What's actually happening in both those cases, I think, is both guys have a common affliction, which is they cannot sacrifice their own personal piety for the sake of the people. Because in both cases, it's really, worship isn't really worship if I'm not doing it the way that I feel comfortable doing it and the way that I want to express things. The only sense in which they're different, those kind of cartoonish examples, is the typical Fort Wayne grad wants his own personality to dissolve into the office, and then the typical St. Louis grad wants the office to dissolve into his personality. So one guy is sort of like, I don't have anything to offer the world, but if you can clothe me in the name of Christ, and I become Christ in the stead of the people, then I matter. And then the other guy is, if Christ can dissolve into me and it becomes my personality and my winsomeness, that's actually going to kind of be the sacrament that wins people for Christ. And in both those cases, I just think the issue is you're dealing with losers who want a captive audience. And so those are the guys that it's maybe kind of hard to spot that, I suppose. But like, if you don't know so growing up having my dad as my pastor, my dad was a normal person. My dad's the coolest guy I've ever known in my life, but he was never trying to be cool on Sunday morning. And he talked normally from the pulpit, and he prayed normally. I remember going to seminary, and there were guys like I just couldn't even sit next to him, because you'd talk to him and they'd talk normally, and just talking like we're talking. And then it would come time to pray, and they would go, "Our Father who art in heaven." And you're going, just say, what are you doing?
Yeah.
Just say the words normally.
Yeah.
And so there was a kind of like, I need to impress,
like
other
perform.
people. Right. And don't do it.
Yeah.
If that's your impulse, don't do it. You got to view it as, I'm here to proclaim the gospel, and Christ could use anyone. But if he's chosen me, he doesn't need anything from me. And I don't need to gussy this up with something. I don't need to fix a deficiency in the word. Just be a normal person, and don't indicate to people that what you're doing is sort of performative, because then they'll sit there and go, well, then what do I need to do in order to be, if this is the weird stuff you got to do in order to be acceptable to God, what's the stuff that I got to do to be acceptable to God?
Yeah. So so you go through SEM. At what point did like comedy and theology become mixed for you? And what were influences?
It's kind of at SEM. So
and I guess the reason I'm asking, so you have Lutheran Satire.
Yeah.
If you just so for those that don't know that, like you did comedic videos that had satire that kind of taught the Lutheran faith.
Yeah. So it's a YouTube channel I've run for 13 years, 14 years now, something like that, where I endeavor to teach the Lutheran faith with short little videos, making fun of stuff. What I have kind of found throughout the years was, if you use humor, you can kind of pick ideas apart much more efficiently than if you're just doing kind of traditional teaching. So my goal with the videos is not like, I don't expect anyone to become Lutheran from watching them. It's not meant to replace catechesis. It's more so to kind of put it out there for people. So either if you're already Lutheran, you can say, yeah, that's a kind of a crisp, efficient way to express what it is that I believe that I couldn't quite put into words. And if you're not a Lutheran, for people to see it and go, I kind of felt like something was missing in my understanding of this issue, whatever it might be. And that seems to kind of track with what I was thinking, even if I couldn't verbalize it. So maybe I should go check out a Lutheran church, which is the greatest emails I've ever gotten in my life have been, the greatest email I ever got in my life was an email from my future wife. Well, she's my now wife, but back when she was my future wife, telling me I was wrong. This was great.
Really?
So we met when we were like, I was 13, she was 12. And my dad and her dad were really good friends at the seminary. And I remember thinking she was really cute, and she remembers me ignoring her. And a number of years later, our dads were talking, and they thought we might make a good match for each other, so they conspired to get us together. And the idea was I'd do a summer vicarage at her dad's church. So I email her dad about this, and I say, yeah, I've never been to Texas before. I'd be interested in doing that. And I said, by the way, I remember you guys coming through a number of years ago. I remember meeting your daughter, Katie. Please send her my regards. So he tells her this, and she goes, that's not what happened. Give me his email address. And she had to promise her dad for 2 days that she would be nice to me. And so she emailed me to tell me that's not at all her recollection of what happened. And I immediately liked her energy and her spirit. And a few months later, we were married. It was a fantastic thing. So what were we talking about before that?
The coming together of humor, theology, and that was the purpose.
So I always kind of liked writing little skits and stuff, and then when I was at seminary, not to reveal trade secrets, but there's a party every year that happens at the Fort Wayne Seminary called allegedly happens called the Q Party. I won't explain all of the history of why it's called that and what happens. But every year there's a document that's put together.
Actually, the history might be interesting for those. Just maybe a brief overview of what Q is.
So in biblical higher criticism, so basically if you approach the scriptures from the perspective of there's not like a God or anything, and so where did the Bible come from? You have this question of, well, why do Mark's gospel and Matthew's gospel have some stuff in common, and then Matthew and Luke have some stuff in common that's not in Mark? Where did that stuff come from? So the theory was that there's a lost document that Matthew and Luke were based upon, and it's called Q for short, which is short for the German word Quelle, which means source. So as Bible believing Lutherans, we reject the Q hypothesis. We believe in this radical idea that there's a God who talks to us and that the way the Gospels got there was from things having happened for real, and that people who saw them wrote them down by inspiration of the Holy Spirit. But the Q Party was a sort of a mockery of that. Was every year you'd have a different Q document, and it was a thing just kind of making fun of seminary life and things that might be going on in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. And so every year there was a guy who would be there was a guy who would be the Q redactor, the guy in charge of putting together the Q document. And so someone gave me the responsibility of doing that. A previous redactor gave me the responsibility of doing that my second year, and then I ended up doing it my fourth year as well. And so that was a lot of fun. I enjoyed that. And then I got off into the parish, and I'd occasionally write these little skits, and I didn't know what to do with them because, this was back in the YouTube existed, but this was, I didn't have the money to like actually film actors and things like that. And a friend of mine mentioned to me how I was talking to her about this, and she said, well, there's this software you can use. It's like text to type, and it'll have CGI characters that'll just say the things that you write. So that was how I started doing Lutheran Satire. And it was originally just these kind of robotic voices, and I would write the scripts in such a way that if something's very monotone, there are certain words that are funnier that way. And so I did videos like that for a couple of years, and it started off just kind of making just jokey videos about kind of Lutheran inside baseball stuff, liturgical fights and things of that nature, pink chasubles and liturgical dance and stuff like that were the first couple of videos. And then I started to realize that there's actually a great capacity for being able to teach people stuff with this. So that beyond just kind of making fun of stuff, I could actually probably give whoever was out there in the YouTube watching universe a sense for what Lutherans believed. Because this is always sort of the challenge that we Missouri Synod Lutherans have is like no one knows the first thing about us. We don't exist in the public consciousness at all. And
if we do, they probably think ELCA.
Right, yeah. So they either think ELCA or they think we're Catholic light or kind of whatever it is. So there's not the even if you were to ask the average just kind of I've been to church like 6 times in my life type person, what are Catholics all about? and they'd go, they kind of got like the Pope and the saints and stuff, and they have like candles and, and like rules and stuff you're supposed to follow. And you go, all right, what are evangelicals about? And they go, they kind of like put the hands up in the air, and they got like rock band church. And if you were to say, and they make a big deal about making a decision for Jesus. And you go, if you were to say, what do Lutherans believe? They'd go, I don't have the slightest idea. So my kind of thought was, well, it would be good to fill that gap. And if you can do it with humor in a way that sort of disarms people, and creates a curiosity. I don't want to be people's teacher in that sense. I don't want to be a pastor on the internet, but I would like to kind of push people towards like, you should look into this. You should check this out, and find a Lutheran church near you. And so that was kind of my goal with it. And so I've been doing that for 13, 14 years now. So that was off and on. I always have. I don't put out as many videos as I like. I eventually moved away from the robo voices. The software went kaput, but also it was just way too limiting with what I was able to do. And so I started, recording live, real dialogue, mostly myself, because I'm persnickety and a perfectionist. My wife has been in some videos, and she really, really hates when I give her direction. She does, like, I'll do the same. I'll do 20 takes on the same line until I get it the way that I want it, which is fine for me. But when I ask another human being to do that, in particular one who does your laundry, it's like, it's not great.
Yeah.
There's a familiarity there that just doesn't quite work. But yeah, that was kind of always the goal with that, and I've certainly been happy with how it's turned out. I don't put out as much stuff as I'd like to because it's really time consuming.
Yeah.
Average video, an average non-musical video. If I do a video that involves like a song, that'll be way longer. But if I just do it, your average non-song video probably takes me 30 hours from beginning of writing it to uploading it. So it's a long process.
When did things take off? Was there a specific video where things kind of went viral, or because you've got like 90,000 YouTube subscribers?
Yeah, 80. Yeah, somewhere around 80, 90,000, something like that. Yeah. I think so. The first one where I noticed this was going somewhere was, so I'm a bit of a contrarian by nature, and so I started doing these videos. And I did one on sort of dealing with biblicist type people, people who you can't say anything without them going, well, where does the Bible say that? So you go, we shouldn't do insurance fraud. Like, where does the Bible say insurance fraud? And so I did a video on biblicism, and I noticed a gay ELCA pastor liked it and shared it. And I thought, I don't want you to think that you're the same thing as me. So I did a video on the differences between the ELCA and the LCMS.
Yeah.
And that hit around 5,000 views after a couple of days. And I thought, oh my gosh, that's like because prior to that, they were getting kind of a couple hundred, maybe 1,000. And I thought, oh gosh, this is kind of going somewhere. But the biggest one, the real kind of breakthrough one, was the St. Patrick's Bad Analogy.
That was the first one I saw, yeah.
Yeah. And so that was one of my earliest ones where I was moving into more traditional animation. I got some software that if you upload a picture, if you upload a picture of a character, it'll identify, the mouth and the nose and the eyes and make it blink and make the mouth move. And if you plug in dialogue, it'll recognize the sounds, the letters that you're saying, and make the lips move in such a fashion to do that. And that was that one took off. And that's still to this day is my most viewed video. That one's, I think that's maybe my only one that has individually that has over 1 million views.
It's got over 1 million views. Wow.
Yeah, it's probably maybe closer to 2. I mean, that one is probably over 2 million at this point. I try not to pay too much attention to that stuff. I always try to kind of keep a very sort of punk rock nature to Lutheran satire of like, I don't want to know what people like. I don't want to know what people think is funny, because the best stuff I've done is just the stuff that's funny to me. And the second that I start kind of taking into account what other people are viewing, it's becoming a product rather than what I want it to be, which is jokes with teaching.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's take a quick break, and then we'll come on back. We're good to go. Bennett says we're back.
All right.
Okay. So let's shift a little bit. And what are some things going on in the church that you think, we should know about, should be addressed, worth talking about.
So, yeah, you mean the kind of the larger culture of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to tell. I mean, so I'm very active on Twitter. It's called X now.
Mm-hmm.
It's a silly thing.
You don't like it? I like it.
No, I don't like it because a tweet was a very descriptive. It was a very valuable term for what you're doing. It's different than a post, different than a memo. I don't know what you would call anything. So,
what is it now?
Now they just call them posts. The same thing you do on Facebook. But Twitter had its own thing of like, no, a tweet's different. Yeah. So they gave that up. So I'm fairly active on there, and so sometimes it's kind of hard to tell like what's really going on in real life as opposed to what's just sort of an online trend. Because I deal with my congregation, but I don't really deal with anyone else's congregations, and so I'll go to Winkles and pastors' conferences and stuff and talk with other guys, but you don't really always have the strongest sense of sort of what's going on elsewhere. So I think what you can find though on social media is there's kind of interesting stuff going on with our youth, and there are some sort of movements amongst our younger men of a kind of a combination of guys that have a very sort of pious desire to develop a very robust biblical worldview, and a worldview that sort of recognizes the failings of a lot of what we kind of saw, last bit of the 20th century and into the first part of the 21st century, that sees sort of the effects that feminism has had on the culture and on the church, sort of turning niceness into a kind of a mark of the church, as opposed to opposed to the actual marks of the Church of the Word and Sacraments, but also that sees sort of that's hostile to boldness. And I think if you're a young Lutheran guy, there's an interesting kind of trend in the church where churches like the LCMS, so any church body that is like rooted in a confession of faith, whether that's the LCMS or maybe kind of some of these more reform groups, you tend to have more young men than you have young women. And in the evangelical churches, where it's much more kind of freeform and oftentimes less confessionally based and more sort of relationally based, you have more young women. So
we're seeing more young men. Catholic Church seeing more young men, Orthodox.
Whereas again in the evangelical churches, you'll just find a lot more single young women in those circles. And so I think there are a lot of young men that have grown up in a world that has taught them to hate themselves on account of their sex, on account of their race, and have recognized the worthlessness of that and the hostility of that, and see in the Christian faith and in the Lutheran confession of faith something greater. But at the same time, there's a pull towards, I guess I would put it this way. So the more Lutheran you are, in all honesty, the more likely you are to be probably fairly politically conservative. In this, at least in the sense of, not even so much in like a traditional sense of, should the federal government have more power or should states have more power, but on sexuality issues, on culture war issues, which is really the kind of defining characteristic, I think, of modern politics. Like Donald Trump is not a small government. He's not anywhere approaching a small government conservative. He may occasionally here or there kind of fire in that direction.
Although see with Doge what happens there.
Right.
But historically that was not the case in his first term for sure.
Right. But he's not an ideological small government person. He
doesn't fall like the Austrian
He's in
school
favor of efficiency and whatever it takes to get the job done. And if that works by being a conservative, then great. And if it works by just ignoring the constitutional process in his mind, then great. So he's not an ideologue in that regard.
Yeah.
But I think by and large, when you look at what really kind of are the markers of being a conservative and being a liberal now these days, it's largely rooted in cultural issues. It's rooted in how you view sexuality issues and how you view the relationship between men and women, masculine and feminine roles. So that kind of culture war stuff there's not really any way to be a confessional Lutheran and not be on the conservative side of that kind of culture war stuff, right? So you're obviously going to reject gay marriage. You're going to reject the sexual licentiousness of the culture. You're going to look at feminism and say, well, the issue here is that feminism has fundamentally rejected motherhood. And there's no way to square that with a biblical view of vocation and of finding peace in the flesh that God gave you. So I think you have a lot of young men who have kind of perceived that, but the challenge becomes all people want validation in some way, shape, or form. And we were kind of talking about this before, like with pastors. This is the kind of the challenge with pastors, is that you get a lot of guys who go into the ministry because they just want people to tell them that they're good. And everyone needs that to some extent. And if you don't have that in kind of the natural ways and the normal ways, you'll start looking for it in other circles. And something I've perceived in it's not just Lutheran circles, but in kind of conservative Christian young men's circles, is that what they're looking for is the validation of the in-group people, and oftentimes the validation of higher status males within that group. And the problem with that becomes that when validation comes from saying the things that you're not supposed to say according to the kind of squishy liberal mindset, there's a switch that can take place. So, all right. So in other words, like I think a good example of this would be like in how we talk about like this kind of weird spot we find ourselves in with the issue of how people view the Jews. I tend to kind of try to avoid using the term anti-Semitism because I don't think it's a terribly helpful term, but like just broadly speaking, Jew hatred. And so you look at, so you see this rising on both kind of the left and the right. And on the left, it's pretty easy to understand, which is they're communists and they think in terms of oppressors and oppressed. And so if you look at like the Israel-Palestine conflict, they go, well, Israel has power, so therefore they're the oppressors, which means they're bad, which is a very sort of shallow, juvenile way of looking at things. It's very the division between Israelis and Palestinians is obviously a horrifically complex issue. But the idea that like, oh, well, just the people that have more power are the bad guys. Well, or it could be that the bad guys are lunatics, and the reason they don't have power is because lunatics aren't good at like running governments and establishing civilization and things of that nature. You know, so it's easy to see how the left gets there. For the right, there's I think there's this sense of there are a whole bunch of things that you're not allowed to say, even though they're true and they're objectively true, right? So you're not allowed to say, for example, that Black Americans commit a disproportionate amount of crimes, even though it's true. Without, you don't have to make any value judgment on it whatsoever, and you can add in 8 trillion other factors that would sort of explain things in a way that doesn't that doesn't pour out condemnation upon people for the color of their skin.
You're not allowed to say this,
but you're just not allowed to. You're not allowed to say the statistic. It's ironic that it's impossible to say the statistic, right? So this group will look at stuff, and they'll like you can look at the Black Lives Matter thing, and it'll go back to that that summer of 2020, and where people are I remember seeing a video of some guy interviewing Black women on the streets in St. Paul, in the area, St. Paul area, where there are a lot of riots going on. And they were saying, they said, the guy interviewing them said, how many unarmed Black men do you think police kill every year? And they said, it's thousands. And the real answer is it's like 15. So just, so you can assert things that are totally, completely false. And that's fine because it disparages white folks, right? And creates this demon of evil white police officers. But yeah, you couldn't say things like you're way more likely if you're a white man, you're way more likely to be a victim, or white person, you're way more likely to experience violence at the hands of a Black man than a Black man is from the hands of white people. So you can't say things like that. And then if you look at, for example, like the Jewish issue, there are things that you can't say because they're supposedly anti-Semitic, even though they're inarguably true. So like if someone says the Jews run Hollywood, I recognize that there's a way you can say the Jews, which reveals that you hate them, right? But saying the majority of Hollywood studios have been run by Jewish people throughout history is inarguably true. And it's like you look at and it also makes total sense because Jews invented Hollywood. Like they started motion picture companies, back in the day. So again, you don't even have to assess a negative moral judgment to it. You're just not even allowed to say it. And I think what happens with zealous young guys is they perceive you're not allowed to say things that are true because this group over here says that that's offensive and hateful and racist. So you're not allowed to say the things that are true. And then there's a kind of a brain rot switch that's flipped where you then come to the conclusion, the more I'm not allowed to say it, the more true it must be. So in other words, if I'll get in some trouble for saying Jews run Hollywood, and then if I say the Holocaust didn't happen and I get in way more trouble for that, then I must be getting in trouble because it's true. So that's the kind of switch I think that happens with a lot of these young guys.
So because one thing that I can't say is true, all the other things I'm not allowed to say are probably also true.
And the more unutterable they are, the truer they must be. So, and then what happens is that you get into these sort of validation circles where you have guys.
Clarify what you're saying. You're pushing back against that.
Right. You're pushing back against
you
that.
are pushing back against that.
I am personally pushing back against that.
You're pushing back against that. That is a problem when people take and they say, okay, because I'm not allowed to say this, it's true. Right. Therefore, these other things I'm not allowed to say must be true.
Right.
You're
saying that's where everything falls apart.
Yeah. Okay.
Because it's no longer about evidence and facts and understanding. It's about I say a thing that I'm not supposed to say, and the negative reaction is actually the evidence that it's true, as opposed to like the evidence is the thing that makes it true. So that's what I'm criticizing there. And I think what happens with young guys on top of that is that then you get these kind of affirmation circles where you find a bunch of online friends and you all kind of you're on the same page with this. And then the more willing you are to say something that's unutterable, the more committed to the cause you are, which kind of spirals things. And which is, I think, where you then get into this kind of like weird realm of conspiracy theories. There's a guy I know, I don't know him personally, but in the news through some other friends and on a text thread a while ago was espousing this idea that the Jews did 9/11. And that there were it's this conspiracy theory about how there were secret coded messages in the walkways going to the Twin Towers that only Jews would have understood, because they went to all of the Jew meetings. They went to all of the secret code Jew meetings. That were telling them don't go to the Twin Towers because, bad stuff's going to happen today. And I said, well, what benefit would the Jews have from doing 9/11? And the answer was so that the United States would get involved in the Mideast and destabilize Middle Eastern countries, which would make Israel stronger. And where that kind of falls apart to me is we've been doing that nonstop already for decades. And the United States government does not need extra motivation. They don't need secret terrorist motivation to mess around in countries where everything's going to fall apart. So, but you could just tell that's what it was. Is like I'm more committed to the truth, the more insane of a thing I'm willing to say about this group. And so I think that is you'll find that kind of oftentimes in some Lutheran circles, but it goes beyond Lutheran borders, obviously. And I think the challenge that our young men need to be aware of is we can walk and chew gum at the same time, right? We can, so in particular on the Jewish issue, we can acknowledge the kind of core issue for modern Judaism is the rejection of Christ as the Messiah. Even to the extent where, so in Israel, Israel has what's called the law of return, which is their law concerning who is allowed to become a citizen of Israel based on their Jewishness.
Mm-hmm.
And if you have one, so it's largely an ethnic thing, right? So if you have one Jewish grandparent, you can immigrate to Israel. But there are also laws concerning converts, right? And so if you're if you convert to Orthodox Judaism, you can move to Israel. If you convert to conservative Judaism, you can move to Israel. If you convert to Reform Judaism, you can move to Israel. But you can't qualify if you convert to Messianic Judaism.
Mm-hmm.
Now, as a sidebar, I think Messianic Judaism is silly. That like if you believe Jesus is the Messiah, you're a Christian, and you should just call yourself a Christian because that's what it is.
Mm-hmm.
But from the perspective of Israel, it seems to be that the position of the Israeli government is if you're a Reformed Jew, you can literally believe nothing.
Mm-hmm.
You can be an atheist communist and be a Reformed Jew. But you can't, so that's fine. So you can qualify as a real Jew if you don't believe in God.
Mm-hmm.
But if you believe that Jesus is the Son of God, you're out. That doesn't count.
Mm-hmm.
So you can look at that and you can go, well, all right, kind of seems like the core central issue that unites all Jews, right? They have a lot of disagreements. And if I grew up with my best friends growing up were Jewish. They're a cantankerous bunch of folks, which is a thing that I very much love about them, right?
Yeah.
Which is why I think a lot of these conspiracy theories are silly, is like the idea of a bunch of Jews sitting in a room agreeing on stuff is the dumbest dumbest thing. It's almost as dumb as Lutherans sitting around agreeing on stuff.
Yeah.
If someone came to you and said, there's a conspiracy in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod where a bunch of Lutheran pastors had a convention and they all agreed on something, you're like, that's all right. I know immediately that didn't happen.
Yeah.
because it's never happened. But there's all right. So aside from all of that, right, you can look at we can walk and chew gum at the same time in the sense that we can recognize modern Judaism as it comes out of the Pharisaical tradition, which was rooted in a rejection of Christ. And the same people who were conspiring to put Christ to death, that's the theological tradition that modern Judaism is founded from. So we can recognize the core doctrine of the modern Jewish faith. The one thing that will really make you not a Jew is if you believe in Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
So in that sense, we can say Judaism is kind of the most anti-Christian religion on earth.
Mm-hmm.
Not in a sense of like, any sane person would rather live as a Christian in Israel than as a Christian in Pakistan or in Egypt or, like any Muslim majority country, obviously, if you're being honest with yourself. But just in terms of like the core principle of the religion, Judaism's even probably more anti-Christian than Islam is.
Mm-hmm. So you can be heretical in saying there isn't a God.
Right.
It should be heretical.
Right. But you're still kind of in the club.
Yeah. But if you say you're heretical in saying, yes, I do believe there's a God and I believe Jesus is the Christ.
Right. Then you're out.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So we can look at that and go, well, yeah, you won't find a religion that's probably more centered in a rejection of Christ than Judaism.
What do you think about the phrase Judeo-Christian?
No, I think that's a silly phrase.
Mm-hmm.
And I think people use it because it's sort of this like it's embracing a false notion of what the Christian faith is, as though this idea of like, well, there was Judaism and then Christianity came out of Judaism.
Mm-hmm.
And so we sort of took our own kind of spin on things. Like Aretha Franklin doing her own rendition of Otis Redding's Respect. And her version just got way more popular, right? I just made up that analogy off the top of my head.
That was good, yeah.
Really, really proud of that one.
Pennant loves that.
Right. I do, by the way, love that Aretha Franklin's Respect is considered this great like feminist anthem, and if you look at the lyrics, it's very much the opposite of that.
Is it really?
It's about a guy coming home and expecting respect. Respect from his woman. So I get a kick out of that. But that's obviously an entirely false view of what the actual divide is, which Jesus shows us very clearly in the scriptures. Is when he's saying, like, look, all of the scriptures testify concerning me. If you don't, as he says in the Gospel of John, like, look, if you don't You don't believe in me. Your father's not Abraham. Your father's the devil.
Mm-hmm.
So Abraham saw my day and believed in it. Abraham believed in the promise of the Messiah, believed that his son would be the very son of God.
Mm-hmm.
So in that sense, we say, no. Like Christianity is not an offshoot of Judaism.
Jacob Benson phrased it in a good way when we had him on, and he basically said that, like, what do you refer to Abraham as?
Mm-hmm.
And you refer to him as a Christian.
Right.
And the reason is because what defined the Old Testament people, and it was that they were messianic. They were
Right.
waiting for the Christ.
Right.
So Abraham was right in that he was anticipating the Christ correctly. And then Christians just carry that on where they said, okay,
Right.
but now we know who the Christ is.
Right.
So he would say, it's not like there was a Jewish religion and then Christianity. There was always Christianity, which was being aligned to the Messiah.
Yeah. So when people talk about like the idea of Judeo-Christian values, right,
Mm-hmm.
and the Ten Commandments, well, the reason the reason that entire world cultures have been formed by a certain religious view is not because of post Second Temple Judaism.
Mm-hmm.
It's because of the Christian faith, which was the fulfillment of these promises given to Abraham.
Mm-hmm.
So again, this is a good example of when I say, like, there are certain things that you're supposedly not allowed to say, which are entirely true.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So again, like, I think it's a pretty inarguable statement that just from a historical standpoint, the values that we talk about as Judeo-Christian values are because of Christians.
Mm-hmm.
It's not because of the Judeo part of that in a historical sense. Like, what's been the most, it would be like if someone told you the most influential Beatle was Pete Best,
Mm-hmm.
the drummer that they kicked out before they had Ringo and had their recording contract.
Mm-hmm.
Is you'd go, well, he's sort of like he's a part of the story,
Mm-hmm.
but no, that's not why the song catalog of the Beatles.
Mm-hmm.
So it's another good example of a way in which you're somehow a Jew hater if you won't give 13th century rabbis the same amount of credit as Constantine, or St. Paul for that matter, in the development of Western morality. But it doesn't follow from that again, that like Jews are having secret meetings for how they can undermine, Western civilization. Like a good example of this would be a thing I've seen floating around quite a bit is this idea that the pornography industry was created and run by the Jews.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea is that Jews want to destabilize, they want to war against Christian morality and sort of destabilize the world and fill it with filth on account of their Jewishness.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a little bit of truth in here, and there's also just like a whole bunch of nonsense with that. So part of the issue I see with this is I don't know what you would call this, the noticing fallacy. And it's this weird mental thing that people will do where they go, well, don't you think isn't it weird that so many people in the pornography industry are Jewish? And you go, okay, well, how did you it's like practically everyone. And you go, okay, is it everyone, or did you find a list of all of the people in the porn world and then you just filtered out all the Jewish names and then forgot all of the other names?
Mm-hmm.
So, and likewise, again, like, I mean, if you're looking at it historically, probably the three most, I don't know, I don't want to say important because that's too positive sounding of a term. The three most notorious figures in the mainstreaming of pornography were Hugh Hefner, who created Playboy magazine, who was a lapsed Methodist, and Bob Guccione, who's created Penthouse magazine, who was a lapsed Catholic, and Larry Flint, who created Hustler, who was a lapsed Baptist.
Mm-hmm.
So, again, it's like they're all dead. I think they're all dead. But, so does that factor into the equation, or do you just kind of conveniently forget them? Yeah. Now, you can look and you go, all right, well, apparently the guy who's the CEO of Pornhub, and I believe the guy who's the CEO of OnlyFans are both Jewish,
mm-hmm.
right? And so you go, all right, well, that's like, there's nothing there. But at the same time, you look at it and you go, all right, well, if you look at like the history of the development of the pornography industry, it's film adjacent. It's wicked and evil, but it's people with cameras and lights and who knew how to develop film and make videos and stuff. And again, Hollywood was an industry invented by very industrious Jewish people. Now, I don't in any way, shape, or form think Hollywood was created by like a meeting of Jews sitting down and going, how can we, destabilize society? And like they were, Hollywood was policing itself with the Hays Code for a number of decades.
What's the Hays Code?
So the Hays Code was back in the day, I don't remember when it ran to up till the 70s, from like probably the 20s up until the 70s. The Hays Code was a self-policing mechanism that Hollywood had it was sort of an agreement of like, this is the stuff we won't put in film. So, we don't put nudity in films, and we won't depict this thing and that thing and the other thing. And so, all of those Jewish-run studios were voluntarily abiding by this. So, Hollywood obviously puts out a ton of filth, and I'm not in any way, shape, or form defending that. But that's more kind of a downstream effect of, well, you look at when did Hollywood start producing really licentious films? And it's right at the time of the sexual revolution, which was largely empowered by the birth control pill and a whole host of other kind of cultural changes. So it's not as though, like, unless you're going to argue the evil Jewish executives were just sort of sitting in the background waiting for the moment to execute
in
their
40
master
years
plan.
we'll play this
Right.
off. Yeah.
So, and again, like, it was just the same Jewish studios that were putting out also, there were some amazing, Ben-Hur's an amazingly, fantastically, beautifully Christian film that, that won 11 Academy Awards, came out in 1959. And so it's not so easy. It's not as simple of a thing as like these evil Jews were running things. Obviously, they're not. You're not going to expect to see a bunch of material that they're putting out promoting Christianity. But it's not so simple as like it was. It was just this cabal of society destroying Jews running thing. And so in the same way with the pornography thing, well, you'd probably expect to find. Since Jews were already well overrepresented in Hollywood, in production, you would expect to find an overrepresentation of them in porn, which is again kind of Hollywood adjacent. Now, obviously, if you're a devout Christian, that's not a world that you're going to go into. But there are a lot of lapsed Christians that have gone into that world, people who grew up in the church and turned away from the faith. And while secular Judaism, I will certainly say, you can certainly concede, kind of seems to punch above its statistical weight class in terms of that kind of stuff. The reality is, I don't think there's any real evidence that like you had a bunch of very observant Jews sitting around, reading the Torah in Hebrew for 5 minutes to open a meeting and then saying, okay, now let's get back to the business of dehumanizing, both men and women with this industry that we're creating. So there's a kind of thing where I don't know. I mean, like the world that you grow up in. So there are a lot of Jews in finance, right? Because that was historically has been a realm that a lot of Jews were in. So of course you'd expect to find more of them in there. In the same way that you would expect to find Italians overrepresented in pizza restaurants or sons of pastors overrepresented in the ministry. When that's a world that you grow up in, you're kind of familiar with it. And so I think this is kind of the challenge with a lot of young guys is they're smart enough to recognize, oh, a second, like there's a lot of Jewish names showing up in here, but they're so inclined to say, well, like I've got my nose on I've figured out what it is that other people haven't figured out,
That's
and I'm
idea.
bold enough to say the thing that you're not supposed to say by attributing this to some sort of evil, as opposed to there are kind of a lot of historical explanations for why you would find more Jews in that industry, but also when you become sort of obsessed with the issue, you don't realize you're doing things like I did a word find of, I Googled people in the pornography industry, and I did a word find for the last name of ending in Steen, and look at all of the result, and 13 out of 100 people have Jewish names, and you're like, well, then that means that the vast majority of them weren't.
Yeah.
And I think it's looking for validation by being willing to say the thing that you're not supposed to say, because supposedly when you're not supposed to say it, that's how you can know that it's true.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the danger in that is, at least for guys who are coming at this, who are seeing themselves as Christians and want to be bold Christians, is that there's a danger in turning confessional Lutheranism into a skin that you wear as sort of part of your masculine identity that you're creating for yourself, and it's an aesthetic rather than a confession of faith that is forming the way that you view everything.
Mm-hmm.
So this is, I mean, to me, in the end, this is kind of the issue, is like, all right, well, if you don't want Jews to know Jesus, then you're not a Christian.
Mm-hmm.
So if whatever pieces of information you think you have about the Jews, if your goal is not for them to know the name of Jesus Christ, then you don't believe in Jesus. And to whatever extent you call yourself a Christian, you're just clothing yourself in the based skin that you want to wear so that you can impress your friends or yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And if you do want them to know Jesus, well, then it would probably behoove you to talk to them and about them in ways that will indicate to them that you don't hate their guts and want them to die.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that to me seems like a simple thing. And also not, if you want people to listen to you, you shouldn't presume that you can, like, all right, so there's a bunch of horrific stuff written about Christ in the Talmud. Right, that so that Christ is boiling in excrement in hell, that Mary was conceived a child through an unfaithful relationship with an unknown Roman soldier, or with some man that was
the whole Pantera.
Yeah. I don't know if Pantera that name is in the Talmud, but the claim that Mary was a sexually immoral woman is in the Talmud.
Can you explain what the Talmud is real quick?
So the Talmud, is a series of commentaries on the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, written by Jewish authors, Jewish rabbis throughout the course of kind of forever and long periods of time.
And they kind of get cemented, right? Like it's almost like a creed in that, like, to make it into the Talmud, like it has to go through like an approval process.
Yeah, right? I don't know how all of that works, but what I do know is that, like, the idea that Jews are sitting around, the idea that most Jews have any real clear sense of what the Talmud says about any of these things, I don't think is terribly accurate.
Like if you take like Prager or Shapiro, it's
right.
Probably unlikely that, certainly Prager, I've watched a decent amount of him, it's probably very unlikely that he thinks that Jesus is burning in excrement, or that Mary, like, so those are probably not necessarily representative of.
Yeah, I mean, you'll probably find more of that amongst very, very, very devout Jews, whether they actually believe that or not. Like, but they're going to be more familiar with the Torah.
Okay.
Right. But I mean, again, my best friends growing up were Jews. And when I lived in Connecticut, and they didn't go to church, and I would talk to them about Jesus, and they didn't know the first thing about him. Other than like, they knew, well, I guess we don't really believe in him. But, the idea that, but they weren't going to 5th grade summer camp and memorizing passages about Jesus boiling in excrement. Like, so the idea that that's kind of representative of the Jewish consciousness. I think we can say, like, the Jewish consciousness is the center of my religion, is that Jesus isn't the Messiah. And that's about as bad as it gets. I don't know why we need to invent something worse than that. It would be like if you were, like if you were talking to a lady and she goes, oh yeah, I got divorced. And you go, oh, I'm sorry, what happened? She goes, my husband had affairs with 16 women. And you go, oh gosh. And then you find out he had affairs with 8 women. And you'd go, why are you lying? Like, it's bad enough.
Yeah.
You don't have to add anything to that.
Yeah.
So, the center of your religion being the rejection of the divinity of Christ is bad enough. You don't have to sell me on how that's not good.
Mm-hmm.
But the idea that Jews are sitting around at least in your average American Jew, who goes to temple a couple of times a year, and the idea that they're sitting around just like trading, Jesus is boiling in excrement, baseball cards is I just think entirely detached from reality. And it's a desire to sort of create this enemy that's so much worse than it is, because what you actually think makes you righteous is your hatred of them. If we can read Romans, and when Paul says, like, look, I'd forfeit my own salvation if I could convert my people. Well, like, here's, I think, a general rule in life that's good, a helpful piece of pastoral advice that I would give to everyone. You're not allowed to be angrier at someone for the sin they've committed against someone you love than the person they committed the sin against. Right? So, like, if you punch me in the face, my friend isn't allowed to be angrier at you than I am. And if I forgive you, then what on earth is your friend doing bearing a grudge against that? And so in the same way, like, all right, Christ cries out, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do upon the cross. Christ pours out his blood to forgive those who are firsthand guilty of, not even just in a theological sense, but in a very sort of material sense, guilty of putting him on the cross. And so if Jesus forgives them, what am I doing burning in anger over that? And in the same way, all right, I mean, this is the thing you hear all the time, like, well, the Jews killed Christ. Oh, so did I. I mean, I killed him with my own sins. I put him to death through my own sins. So, like, but if Jesus forgave them, what am I doing? Who on earth am I to, like, he doesn't need me to stick up for him. And what he wants me to do is confess his name to them. So that's probably a better use of my time than showing off to my friends about how willing I am to say that the Jews killed my Lord. And so I think when and likewise, when you look at just kind of this idea of that I need to somehow defend the name of Christ from blasphemy from his enemies. Well, probably the best way for me to defend that name is to not treat his enemies as though they're guilty of things that they didn't do. So of course they're guilty of blasphemy if they don't believe in Christ. I mean, this is one of the things that used to always drive me insane when I was a kid growing up, was that the most common profane utterance from my Jewish friends was, they wouldn't get mad and say the F word, but they would take Christ's name in vain. And that would make me angry. And I would always sort of point that out to them. So, like, all right, they're blaspheming in that sense, but if I want them to stop blaspheming, probably the best way for me to do that is to say, let me actually tell you about who Jesus is and what it means for him to be the Christ. You just confessed him to be the Christ mindlessly. Let me tell you what it means to actually confess him truthfully. Let me show you from the scriptures, from the book of Isaiah, from the book of Zephaniah, from the prophets, what it means for Jesus to be the Christ. And if that's not what you want to do, then you probably just don't actually want them to come to the faith. And this sort of insistence on treating all Jews as though they're sort of equally in the know as to what the Talmud says is just kind of silly and entirely detached from reality.
Are those groups, are they pretty prominent, do you think?
No, I don't think so. But they have an identity that's sort of appealing to people who don't have one. I think this is a challenge for young people today, is no one has sort of a real culture, right? People don't do things together, and so many people are just living their lives on their phone. And so you have people trying to kind of create a subculture for themselves digitally. And you want to find something to kind of rally around. And a common anger is an easy thing to rally around, and fun is easy to rally around. And so conspiracy theories are fun. And if you're a young guy, like, saying forbidden things is fun, and casting everyone else who's not on your side as weak and pathetic and gay is fun, and it's easy, and it's a cheap, easy way for you to kind of build up yourself in your own estimation. So I think there's a lot there that is appealing to folks, even though I don't think the numbers of this are really all that large in the end.
Yeah. Let's move. I'm interested to hear in your take of the large catechism, which has some crossover.
Yeah,
a little bit. Is that right?
Yeah. So there was, this was maybe 2 years ago or so. So the LCMS put out a document. I forget the name of it. This is how invested I still am in it, that I can't remember what it's called. Something like a large catechism annotations, something commentary and annotations, something like that. LACA, whatever. Lutherans love our acronyms and our abbreviations. But it was basically a series of commentaries, relative brief comment, like 3-4 page commentaries on the large catechism. Someone would do one on the first commandment, the second commandment, and Luther's take on all of this. I think it was commissioned by the Synod in Convention. So it's put together with a whole bunch of different authors. And there was stuff in there that I would certainly agree should not have been done. So, it's a series of commentaries on the large catechism, like 500 pages long, something like that. I don't know if it's really that long, but it was long. So it kind of had the air of being for pastors. And a few of the authors were written by women, which sort of raises this question that I don't think the LCMS has ever really kind of had an honest conversation about, which is, what role is there for women writing theology in a way that's sort of teaching? Right? Is that a violation of Paul's command for a woman not to teach or to have authority over a man? And we've kind of had this problem in the LCMS for a long time. We go, all right. Women can't be pastors in the sense that they can't put on the dress and administer the sacraments, and they can't get up in the pulpit in the dress and do a sermon. But we go, all right, but it's like when I was in middle school, I went to a public school in the 90s in a relatively conservative town, so they were still teaching abstinence. And we'd have a lady who would come into health class, and she would teach us about abstinence. And then she would ask for questions, but she would let people ask them anonymously because we don't want kids to be embarrassed, which just meant that you got boys trolling her the entire time. So every time the question was, right. I can't have relations before marriage, but what's as close to that as I can get without doing that, technically, which is a worthless question, both from an anatomical standpoint but especially from a spiritual standpoint. Flee from temptation, right? Don't get as close to it as you can. Don't get as close to sin as you can, and just don't put your toe over the fence. And there's something kind of similar to that, and I think how the LCMS has treated women's issues, where we go, right. We get that you can't ordain a girl, but what's as close to having women pastors as we can without breaking the rule, which is a fundamentally flawed way of looking at things. So LCMS used to not have women's suffrage, and we go, all right. Women can't be equal as men because they can't be pastors. But what if they're 50% equal by letting them vote in voters' meetings? And then all of a sudden it was, can women be lay readers, right? Can they read the lessons? Can they read the Old Testament and the Epistle like some laymen do? And then it was yeah, women can do that. And we have some tortured explanation for how reading the Word of God that you're not allowed to disagree with upon condemnation of your soul. We go, no, that's not authority. A sermon, which could be entirely wrong. A pastor could say 0 words in a sermon that have any authority whatsoever. They can't do that. But the actual source of authority, And so we go, all right, fine, they can do that. All right, can women be presidents of their congregation? Yeah, a little bit later, a few decades later, we'll say they can do that. Can they be elders? Well, yeah, maybe in some circumstances they can be elders, right? They can pass out the body and blood of Jesus and say the blood of Christ shed for you, and we'll make some tortured argument for how that's not exercising authority or administering the sacraments. Just silly, right? So the problem is this kind of stuff has been happening in the LCMS for a long time. So then you have this document that comes out and you go, this kind of looks like it's for pastors. And all of a sudden we're having ladies write for this with sort of no discussion about it. And you can understand how people would go, oh, great. Here's just another thing, another example of an institution just creeping left until it goes the way of the ELCA or the Episcopal Church or kind of whatever it is. So you can understand that response. And then there's a guy named Stephen Paulson who wrote an essay in there. And Stephen Paulson is a pastor in the ELCA has some kind of real issues with his theology, some kind of antinomian bents in his theology. So that was stuff where if I'd been in charge of it, I would have said, let's not have women write for this because that's going to create more. It's going to cause more confusion than it will bring more confusion than light. And that's probably not a role that we want to have women in, at least in the sense of like, if this is indeed for pastors. And likewise, we're not having guys in heretical church bodies write for this.
Why do we need that?
Right. We don't need it.
Question,
right. There's a bajillion other guys that can write the thing. And then but the other sort of, so that was one set of, and I think those were legitimate grievances. Some of the other issues were honestly just kind of like a marketing thing where if you don't know sort of how publishing houses work, which is it's like pastors kind of know that. We sort of know how the sausage is made. If you don't know that, you put out a book that looks like the rest of the Lutheran Confession series that our publishing house puts out. And it has the appearance of, this is the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod's official commentary on the Large Catechism. This is what we as a church body believe the Large Catechism means. And now I know that that's not what it is, and most pastors are going to know that that's not what it is, but there are a lot of folks that it's going to seem like that. And so there were some guys in there that people in there that wrote some stuff that some of it I think was fairly criticized, other bits of it wasn't. And I think if they had just put out a podcast, if they'd said like, hey, let's do a podcast on a series of, however many episodes on the Large Catechism and all these people that they otherwise had write articles for it, we'll just talk to them for like half an hour and they can kind of flesh out these ideas. So there were some things in there, that statements that people made that I think people saw as political statements that they didn't agree with, that if you gave the author 2 minutes to just kind of expand that idea a little bit, it probably would have been fine for most. It would have, kind of calmed down most of the people that would be upset about it. And then there was some other stuff in there that I think just could have been cleaned up in editorial stuff. But the challenge with that is, like if you have a younger, so there was one bit in there, I don't remember who wrote this article, but someone wrote an article on something about homosexuality and talked about people suffering from homosexual desires, which in a certain context is a perfectly legitimate way to talk about that. So like if I'm a parish pastor, if I had a young man in my congregation who was struggling with this and he doesn't want to follow these desires, but they're there and he's enduring that, right? Like in that, there's a sense in which you go, well, he is a victim of demonic assault in the form of homosexual desire, right? But the problem is if you're a younger person and you've grown up in a world where people are constantly casting themselves as victims and presenting it as though like, well, if I struggle with this, then you're not allowed to criticize me for it. And that's a very common thing for that younger folks have seen all the time. Likewise, if you if you've seen the trajectory of a lot of church bodies that have folded on issues of human sexuality, it always comes in the form of like, you start off going, well, we just need to understand. We need to understand where they're coming from. And then understanding very quickly turns into leave them alone. This is, you don't have the right to get in to tell them that they're not a good Christian for this. And then it goes from, we're going to kind of remain agnostic on this issue to, no, this is good and wonderful and great. And you're the one who's sinful for opposing it. That's a real clear trajectory that so many things in organizations have followed. So I think there was a kind of generational divide where if you're a bit of if you're kind of I don't mean to use the term boomer disparagingly.
Yeah.
It's frustrating to me when people do that. But if you are literally of the boomer generation, you're more likely to see, like, all right, if you look at the idea of a gay kid in high school, a boy who, 16-year-old boy who identifies as gay. If you're of the boomer generation and you're a compassionate Christian, you're a bit more inclined to think in your mind, like, oh, that's a kid who's going to get the crap beat out of him at school, and kids will find out about this, and they'll beat him up, and they'll be mean to him. And I want him to know how he should understand the desires that he's going through, and I want him to have peace and comfort in the promise of Christ. And I don't want him to be mistreated, and I don't want him to be a victim of cruelty. I want him to know the truth, right?
Mm-hmm.
But if you're a 20-year-old, that's not anywhere near the world that you've grown up in. The world that you've grown up in is 30 kids in your class have all identified as gay for any number of reasons. And if some kid is just acting like a flaming, gross degenerate in front of you, if you say anything about it, you'll get suspended from school, or you'll get fired from your job, or like any. So the whole kind of power dynamic has shifted, where you as a Christian who opposes homosexuality, you're the one that's in danger of being bullied and abused and being persecuted. And so the problem is, if you're of that generation and you see someone talking about it in a totally valid, in its own kind of context way, you're likely to say, oh, great, here's another example of, like, hey, I grew up in this church over here. Now they're waving the rainbow flag, and I come and I find the LCMS, and I think that we're good and solid. And then all of a sudden they're folding on this issue, when that's not at all the case.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a matter of, like, this would have been good.
Perception.
It's just a perception. It would have been good for people to kind of talk about this a little bit more, and for someone in editorial to go, that's not that that's wrong, but, like, let's find maybe another way to talk about this so that this doesn't cause issues.
Mm-hmm.
So a bunch of people started talking about this online, in particular a number of kind of zealous young men. And so that sort of blows up, and then the LCMS goes, all right, we're going to pause publication of this. And so they did, which enraged a bunch of people who go, hey, you're just, like, listening to a bunch of insane neo-Nazis, which some of them were. Like, some of them were legitimate nut job. I mean, I don't even know what neo-Nazi means, but, like, people who have terrible beliefs and are wretched people.
Yep.
And some of them were people going, hold on a second. Like, they were legitimate, like, faithful LCMS people who love their Lord. And don't hate anybody, and who were just going, no, like, some of these criticisms seem legitimate. And so the Synod unpauses it and then just says, no, everything's fine. We're going to resume publication. We're not changing anything. And that, to me, was a kind of, I don't think that was the best way to handle things, because if you're going to publish anything, you probably got to know, in this day and age, like, there's going to be a mob of some people that are going to get mad about it. So either tweak things at the beginning so that they don't have any legitimate grievances. Don't let them mix legitimate grievances with their illegitimate ones, because you get these groups that go, I want to see wokeness everywhere so that I can be a good person for opposing it. Like, I've tangled with some of these guys online. Like, I'm to the right of Genghis Khan. Like, so the idea, and these guys will accuse me of sort of being a liberal squish, and that I'm soft on homosexuality and stuff like that. Like, I don't mean to boast of myself, but I've written on this a lot of things. For a number of years ago, I was writing pretty regularly for the magazine The Federalist. I wrote an article for The Federalist that was one of their highest read articles of the year. There's a piece called Selma Envy, where I was talking about how basically the gay rights movement it was fueled by people who wanted to have their own civil rights movement, but were too lazy and immoral to recognize judging someone based on the amount of melanin he has in his skin is not the same thing as judging people for sexual behavior. And I got death threats and, like, hate.
Did you really?
Yeah, and just vicious hate mail. Not for long. It lasts for 2 days. It's fine.
Then they move on to the next one.
Yeah. So some girl shot a giraffe, and then they were all mad at her after that. But the whole point is, like, I'm not trying to toot my own horn. there's no pastor in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod who has written more boldly and prominently against the LGBT stuff than I have.
Mm-hmm.
But because I'm sitting here going, no, guys, someone saying that someone suffering from homosexual desire is not the Synod trying to normalize and approve of gay marriage.
Mm-hmm.
And you're being ridiculous if you're saying that. But the whole point is, like, when your whole identity is bound up in I'm bold and I'm the one holding the line and I'm the one reclaiming the traditions of my father and everybody else is folding and caving, when that's what you want to see, it's all you can see.
You kind of have to assert yourself over everyone, right?
Yeah. And so I think it would have been better for the Synod one, it would have been best for them to completely re-envision the project and, like, don't put out a book that looks like it's the official Missouri Synod position on the large catechism. Don't make it look so official. But then once they kind of paused publication, they should have said, all right, we shouldn't have done this and we shouldn't have done this. We're going to take this out. We'll put out a new edition of it, and we'll pull these things out. But by kind of saying everything was fine, it was like throwing red meat to this crowd that was going, see, the LCMS is going woke, when they didn't kind of really address things that probably should have been addressed. And I think if you would have just said, no, this stuff is that's a legitimate grievance, and then pointed to the other stuff and said, there's an article in there written by a lady, which again, I've addressed that, but she was trying to make the point about how your sins need to be more important to you than the sins of other people.
Mm-hmm.
And she used as a very kind of incendiary example the issue of pedophilia, and said pedophilia can be the speck in someone else's eye and you need to worry about the log in your own.
Mm.
Now, obviously there's a sense in which we go, well, in a human sense, like, no, you coveting your neighbor's Mustang is not worse than pedophilia.
Mm-hmm.
And pedophilia is a much, much, much bigger problem and heinous beyond heinous.
Mm-hmm.
Now, her overall point, though, is you need to be forgiven for your sins, and your neighbor's sins aren't going to stop you from inheriting eternal life, but you clinging to your own sins will. There's a valid point, but again, like, it's this thing where an editorial, I would have just said, don't use that as an example. That's going to just, like, set things on fire that don't need to be set on fire. But a lot of the people who were criticizing the whole Large Catechism project said, and I've had this argument with people, she was trying to normalize pedophilia. Or the LCMS is trying to normalize pedophilia. You're a stupid, self-blinded, just raging idiot if you believe that she was trying to normalize pedophilia, or that the LCMS is trying to make people in our church body theologically comfortable with the most heinous thing you can imagine. You're a dumb moron who doesn't deserve for anyone to take you seriously if you legitimately believe that that's what they were trying to do.
Did you engage that?
Yeah.
What was their response?
Not really anything other than I'm gay and weak and pathetic. So, but again, it's just that thing of, like, I'm a good person, I have value. The other boys in the chat, when they see me raging against the weak men, then I'm strong and bold, and they pat me on the head and tell me I'm good. And so the problem is that you need other people to be weak in order to prop up that system. It's very kind of humorously to me that it's very much kind of the same thing as what you'll see, like, with race hoaxes. So these stories you'll always see. You have to always know they're fake, right? So some lady posts a picture. She was waiting tables, and here's the bill. And someone writes, "We don't like your kind around here, N-word," and then gives her a 0 tip.
Mm-hmm.
And the whole internet goes, "Can you believe?" And you're going, "It's fake. It's fake. It's fake. Everyone knows it's fake. These are always fake. 100% of the time, they're fake." But they do that because the mindset of so many people is, I'm a good person for opposing racism. Well, then that means that in order to be a good person, you need racism to happen. Like, this isn't you don't need this in Christianity, right? I mean, in order to be living a righteous life, obviously we recognize our righteousness comes from Christ, but just in a kind of sanctification sense, right? Like, I need to follow the 10 Commandments. I want to live according to the 10 Commandments. I don't need anyone to break the 10 Commandments for me to follow them. I don't need someone else to commit adultery for me to be faithful to my wife.
Mm-hmm.
I don't need someone else to dishonor their parents for me to honor my parents, right? But in the woke religion, you need other people to sin so that you can oppose them.
Mm.
And in particular, you need people to do racist sins. There was a movie, I don't remember the name of the athlete. He was, I believe, the first black guy to win the Heisman Trophy. And there's a movie made about Ernie Hudson's from Ghostbusters.
Was it
Something.
Was it with Alabama?
Yeah.
Okay,
right.
yeah.
And so there's a scene. So I think he played for Alabama. Is that right?
I didn't see the movie. I remember hearing kind of some commentary.
Right. So, all right. All I remember is this. So that there's a scene in the movie that was completely made up where they go to University of West Virginia to play. And as the black running back is coming on or off the field, all of the rednecks from West Virginia are throwing beer bottles at him. Like, rah, 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 get off our field, stay away from our women and all that stuff, right?
Yeah.
Never happened. Did not happen in real life. And the movie came out and all the people from West Virginia are going, what the heck, dude? Like, what are you doing to us? That didn't happen.
Yeah.
But you can see the mindset of Hollywood, which is, well, we're good for opposing racism. And here's how racist the world is. So racist that we had to make this movie. And if the world wasn't actually as racist as we say it is, we have to make the world racist because that's how racist the world was.
Mm.
And you're going, well, even if it wasn't that racist, the world was that racist.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to just create racism where it doesn't exist. You have to create race hoaxes in order to triumph over them. If you're Jussie Smollett, when they're like a black NASCAR driver who pretended that someone had hung a rope from his garage.
Okay.
In reality, it was the same rope that like all of the garage stores have or something like that. I don't remember all the details. But you need other people to be racist. You need to invent racism where it doesn't exist so you can become righteous by opposing it. And it's the exact same thing with these guys. They need to create weakness and effeminacy and an unhealthy love of Jews or like whatever the thing is. They have to create something that's not
something
there
to oppose,
so that they can oppose it. And in the end, it's the same religion as wokeness. Mm-hmm. You need other people to be sinners in order for you to be righteous. Mm-hmm. And there's it's a recipe for misery. Mm-hmm. You can't possibly be happy and fulfilled in a world where you need other people to be destroying the world in order for you to be good.
Mm. What's the right equilibrium for, these young men? Because they're, like you said, like there's a truth that comes with that where for a while we've been told, hey, can't say these things that are true. And that's not good. That's one side. And then the other side is, you go down these conspiracy theory rabbit holes or you kind of fall into this anti-wokeism, which ends up being wokeism, right? So what's this good kind of thread of having kind of a resurgence of, maybe it's kind of an orthodox commitment, a full Christian identity. Maybe you can even speak to like Christian nationalism in connection with this. But what's kind of that right equilibrium?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the easy answer is always the Sunday school answer of Jesus. And so when you have the righteousness of Christ, again, as I was saying before, that righteousness is not dependent on anyone else. I don't need anyone else to be holy or wicked in order for the blood of Christ to forgive my sins and for the blood of Christ to make me acceptable to my God. Everything that I need to be good and to be worthy of love has been poured out upon me in the blood of Christ. And on account of that, I can confess the truth, but I don't need anyone else to be a demon in order for me to be worthy of the songs of the angels. And so that's obviously, if you get that right, then everything else kind of falls into place. And so which means that as a Christian, I can can call balls and strikes when it comes to whatever it is, right? Mm-hmm. So I can, in particular, if you just have like hard data that you can look at, right? So like what we were talking about before is, all right, I can look at a statistic on a piece of paper and recognize that Black Americans commit a disproportionate number of crimes. Mm-hmm. And I can acknowledge that. I don't have to live in this fear of, I can't say a thing that other people will perceive as racist because that will make me a bad person. What makes me a good and holy and righteous person is the blood of Jesus Christ. I already have that. So I can look at that and acknowledge that while also recognizing my own sinfulness and recognizing, well, there are more factors at play in this. And like, if you look at the crime rates of Black Americans, they even out when you account for who's raised in a house by a mother and father. So there's just more family brokenness in Black communities. And the more poverty begets poverty, which begets more kind of brokenness and family dysfunction. And so I can recognize there's not something within me that's greater than these people at all.
So it's moving you towards a solution, like the way that you went through that.
Yeah, and if I had been born into circumstances where and I'm not obviously not saying that this is the normal Black experience. I don't want people to think that I'm saying that. But if I had been born into impoverished, crime-ridden neighborhood that's a predominantly Black neighborhood, why on earth do I have any trust that I would end up any different? So there's nothing within me that makes me greater or more righteous, but my righteousness comes from Christ. So I can look at that and acknowledge a thing for what it is, while also acknowledging I have no reason to hate people for the color of their skin, and I have nothing to gain from hating people from the color of their skin. And in the same way, I can look at my Jewish neighbors, and I can say, no, we don't worship the same God, right? They've rejected Christ. They've rejected the Son. They don't have access to the Father. And that I'm not a bad person for saying they need to know the salvation of Christ in order to have eternal life. But I don't need to become a good person by being sort of caustic about it, or by trying to turn them into some sort of demon that they're not, and trying to treat individuals as though they're part of some nameless, faceless cabal. And I can look at my Jewish neighbors and say, well, they need the gospel as much as I do, and I'm not any more righteous than they are, and I'm not any more apart from my baptism, I'm not any closer to God than they are. But I was given a gift in those waters. I was given a gift through the word that I received, and I should want to share that with them, as opposed to want to blame them for a bunch of problems that they as individuals most likely aren't actually guilty of being a part of, and viewing them in a way that will cause me to see them not as individual people that Christ loves and cherishes and died for, and instead seeing them as some sort of amorphous blob that I get brownie points for hating and despising.
Yeah, that's good. I mean, it comes down to a lot of it seems to be an extension of pride. Right. Like it's just, and pride can be applied to all of these things. And it seems like pride is kind of subversive in that it can go into kind of right ideas and then kind of break it. Right. And that, like, it's the same thing of like you striving to do good things. Right. Which is great. You going and doing charity, like you're volunteering for a charity, and it's like, okay, that's a great thing. It can be really detrimental to you if it's an aspect of pride, if it's a way of kind of bolstering yourself over and against those around you, right? And it becomes also often kind of manifests as toxic charity. So it's like, it's that subversive thing where you can be identifying correct issues with some of these groups, might identify a couple correct issues, right? But then they take it to a place then where it becomes egotistical. Right. I mean, one thing I was thinking about earlier real quick, and then, it operates in the same way that like gangs operate, right? Like if you look at kind of like studies of MS-13 and different, like, I mean, it's probably here too, but like in South American gangs, like the first thing you do is you kind of draw them in and give them identity. And then the second thing you do is like they need to do things to prove that they're part of the group. And that keeps upping. So it's like, they'll give them a dog and they'll be like, okay, you have to raise this dog for 6 months. And then you need to kill the dog to know that, like, one, it's kind of destroying of the soul, but two, it's showing that you're willing to do something horrendous for the group. And then it ups and ups and you kind of keep getting status. But it works in that same way too, where it's like, okay, you say the bold things. And now you say the bolder thing. And now you keep going to the boldest thing. And then you keep getting praise from the people that you look up to. And it just kind of takes you and kind of draws you into this.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. That it's a constant auditioning for approval.
Yeah.
And which is always something that you always find in fatherless circles, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's the thing I've noticed with a lot of the guys that are kind of drawn to this is they're coming out of either entirely fatherlessness or functional fatherlessness, where their fathers are very absent, whether they grew up in the house with them or not. It's I want the approval of higher status males, and this is the way that I get it, and I need you to be you or this person over here, that person over there, to be the enemy, so that I can achieve worthiness in the eyes of these people that I want to value.
Mm-hmm. Any last thoughts you want our audience to know?
No.
Okay.
I never. No. I've very much enjoyed this conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this was great. We'll have you. You willing to come up to Minnesota?
I mean, not really, but maybe.
It's in June we get warm weather.
Okay. Yeah, I know. I mean, I spent a lot of my stuff.
That's right. You're from Duluth. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I was born in Duluth, but that's a different country altogether.
Yeah, it is.
No. Yeah. Maybe we'll see.
Okay.
I don't like going places anymore.
Yeah.
It's kind of. I really like staying home.
Yeah.
So if I don't have to fly, so I have this thing. I'm going to as you grow your podcast world, I'm going to give you a piece of advice that I have embraced. It's really made my life better. People will, if you grow an online profile, Lutherans will ask you to come speak at things, which is nice. It's nice when they do that. And I love Lutherans and I love talking to folks, but Lutherans are cheap. And I hate flying. I just don't like the whole, like having to sit in an airport, and I don't like waiting for people to get off of the plane. Like the guy, those people that will, like, everyone gets their bag right away. And then there's always the one guy who's like, I'll get my bag when everyone else in front. And I think he's a bad person. And I think we should throw rocks at him. But Lutherans don't pay well when you speak at things. And so it's really annoying to like have to fly somewhere and go talk to a thing, and then you got to fly back. And I don't like that. So here's the trick I figured out. With people will ask me to speak at things, and they'll say, "What is your fee?" And I will say $1,000. And here's why I say that: not because I deserve it. I don't. I do not have $1,000 worth of intelligent things to say, but the dollar amount that I hate flying is $999. So I like $1,000. That's the lowest dollar amount that I like more than I hate flying.
Yeah.
So that works great, because then they go, well, never mind. And you didn't say no. So you don't have to feel bad about telling someone no, or they give you $1,000 and then you take your family on a little vacation.
It's probably a good test too to how serious they are.
Yeah,
Is this a serious endeavor, or is this something someone's kind of thrown together last second?
Yeah, I mean, like if I have to drive 2 hours and all, that's fine.
Yeah.
But if I have to get on a plane, if I have to connect, which now that I'm in St. Louis, it happens more often. When I was in greater Chicagoland area, you can get direct flights anywhere. But
how do you know? Well, we don't do speaker fees right now, but when we bring people out, we wine and dine.
Yeah, but I don't like flying. I mean, we'll see. But you're a nice guy, and I've enjoyed talking to you.
Yeah.
There's a connection there,
Yeah.
If I get to see friends, it's worth it. I went to I spoke at the last Issues Etc. conference. I've been giving them grief for years because I spoke at a couple of years, and then they didn't ask me for a while. And then they go, "Oh, let's have you. Do you want to come out and do the live broadcast?" And I was like, this is the worst invitation ever. This is like being invited to be an usher in a wedding. You remember like when all your friends were getting married?
Yeah.
And an usher, you still got to pay money for a tuxedo. And so when someone asks you to be an usher, what they're saying is, I like 5 other guys better than you, but I still want you to pay $115 to rent a tuxedo to be in my wedding. So it's the worst thing to be asked to do. So you don't get any of the glory, but all of the inconvenience. And so when they ask you to do the Issues Etc. live broadcast, that's what it is they're saying, you're not like interesting enough to actually put on the poster. You don't have enough interesting things to say to like be a speaker.
Yeah.
But would you still like to travel all the way up here and go to all the inconvenience of coming here to do a thing that's not all that honorable? And I said yes because I'm very good friends with a couple of the people that were speakers, not realizing that. So I had almost double booked myself. I had to go to the Issues Conference, and then I flew out to Virginia to preach at my former field worker and vicar's ordination. So I spoke at the Issues Conference and then immediately had to leave and didn't get to see any of my friends.
Didn't get to hang out with your buddies.
I didn't get to hang, which is the best part.
That's the best part.
Yeah, the best part of the conference.
Well, that's why we liked like the in-person.
Yeah.
The in-person I think was key for us for a handful of reasons. One, I don't think you can have, if you're going to do long form, if you're going to do 2 hours.
Yeah.
Like if we were doing this over Zoom,
like that's rough,
my goodness. Yeah. But just like you can talk to people before, you can talk after, you can build the connections. And I think that works to both kind of bolster the conversation. But also like there's a great value in just like making those connections and getting to know people and everything like that. So
yeah.
All right.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for the time.
Yep.
Cheers.
Cheers.